The second half is going to be specific cases about customers that we work with, and we also share with Search Labs, or some of them we do. And we're going to start talking about House of Fraser. That's the first one. Who's got, can you drive? Can you concentrate on one thing?
It's the right hand up. Yeah.
Next one. Okay, so next slide, Peter. What we're going to talk about here is around House of Fraser, and I guess that there's two aspects. One is that, as Seth mentioned at the beginning with our measured success proposition, there's a bunch of technology and there's a bunch of service, but the reality is that it's quite complicated for a business to go from having no tracking or no idea really what's going on to taking them towards being sort of Amazon or Apple-like, where they know everything about their customers and do amazing marketing. So the emphasis of this talk is going to be some stuff about House of Fraser and what's special about them, but also the journey that we're going on them. So explaining what we've done so far and what the plan is. And the two aspects that I'm particularly interested in are, firstly, what they've done about joining up devices and how far they've got with that. And then secondarily, how they've applied that then to their attribution modelling. I don't know how much people know about attribution modelling. Is there any, the people here, have anybody got experience around building attribution models? Yeah. Okay, good. But I mean, I guess it's the concept of looking at these user journeys and using the journey as a way of dividing up the value of the sale, so that you can value marketing activities not just on a kind of last click win basis. So that's what I'm going to talk around. The thing that's interesting about House of Fraser, they've been going since 1849, so it really is a very, very traditional, proper bricks and mortar retailer. They are still in the top 5 department stores in the UK, and they've only actually been doing online since 2007, so they're actually very late to the game, really. But in that 6 years, it now constitutes 11% of their revenue, which is actually not that high, but it still means across 60 stores, it's the biggest store within their group, so it's extremely important. The stuff that you might not be so clear on is that they really are embracing digital and they're really going for it. They see that as the big future. And the best illustration of that is that they have what they call showroom stores, or buy and collect stores. So the idea is that they've built stores in Liverpool or in Aberdeen where you can't actually buy anything in the shop. It's only a place where you go and you see product and you can try it and feel it and do all the things that most retailers worry about online shoppers doing, but they're actually built a store specifically to do that, and then they provide computers or tablets or whatever for you to place orders in store, which then get delivered to your house. So I think that's a pretty innovative, or it's certainly quite a bold approach to doing things, and I think it's one example of how House of Fraser are actually quite progressive, despite them being thought of as quite a traditional brand. They're also very early adopters of mobile apps. So they've built a bunch of apps, and I think they've learned a whole load of lessons along the way of, should an app just be another version of the website, or if it's not another version of the website, what's actually different about it, and why should somebody use an app rather than just use the website? So they've done quite a lot around that. So I guess that's the part of their business that's maybe people know about less. Next slide, Peter. This is their sort of browsing store, and you can just see that it does have product in there. It looks like a store, but it's obviously a lot smaller, and they don't have all the issues of stock and so on. So that's one of their big innovations. House of Fraser came to DC Storm and were very clear unlike quite a lot of clients that we work with, they were actually very clear about what they wanted to do with us. And it was that they knew they had quite complicated marketing plans. They knew they had quite complicated plans to do with these browsing stores, to do with combining on and offline. And what they wanted to do was, they weren't just saying we want to do attribution. They were saying we're very clear that we want to do attribution, We want it to include all of the channels that we're doing so that we can actually assign value to them and really make budgeting decisions based on understanding of the value of how all the channels work. Now, that may sound pretty obvious, but lots of people come to us with a lot more sort of, it's almost like they hear that other people are doing attribution and they kind of think that they ought to be doing it, and they kind of dip their toe into it with a bit of interest, but not really with a clarity about why they're doing it and with an objective to achieve something. So that's quite different and quite typical of the way that House of Fraser approach things. Their touch point landscape is very, very complicated because of all the activities that they're doing. I'm not going to read them all out. But that does make the challenge really quite complicated. So this illustrates why, if you try and do everything in one go, you're almost undoubtedly never going to get to the end. So if you start saying, I'm only going to start doing my analysis and doing my attribution, once I've got all my touch points assembled and I've got a perfect database which reflects this complete journey, then by the time you get anywhere close to it, probably there'll be a whole load of new channels and they'll have dropped a whole load of stuff which they don't want to do anymore. So what we first start doing is grouping them up into areas related to devices, related to ways of collecting data. And we try and plan a priority list of what are the important things, where are we going to get value early in this journey of attribution. And the idea is that rather than assembling everything before you get started, you take the areas where perhaps you've got data already, or that you can start collecting data quite easily, and you start focusing on those, and you build an attribution model around those, knowing that there are going to be gaps in the journey, but also knowing that to have a better view is infinitely more useful than to have a completely compromised and hopeless view. So it's about trying to create as valuable a picture as you can practically create as quickly as possible. So the roadmap for them, actually there's a couple missing off here, I don't know how we've managed that, but the roadmap that I'm going to talk about on my slide is that the first stage was to establish confidence in the data that they actually have got. So what are the data sources they've got now? And in fact, with House of Fraser, they were all using a rival tracking provider, so the enemy. But it wasn't the right thing to do to just say, well, you need to get rid of that before we can actually do anything. So in actual fact, our starting point of our engagement was to use the data they already had and to build a basic attribution model. So it was using the data they already had, but assembling it in a better way and actually doing something with it. And although we recognised there were compromises and there were problems with that data, it was still a valuable step to actually try and use it rather than just to be collecting data and not doing anything.
Yeah, a key point there is we started off with 8 months historical data from day one, instead of having to wait to build up a data set, which may have taken us 6 months to get to a point where we could actually even start on the attribution analysis. Instead, we could start from day one, and we could have a roadmap that built in the timescales to allow us to move away in a timely manner away from that existing technology and implement the new technology that would give us a better picture.
Also, I was going to speak to Andy, this is also quite an important step when you've got political blockages within the business. And with attribution projects, there's always, or very often, navigating the political landscape is as hard or harder than actually the technical difficulties of building an attribution model. There's invariably supposed winners and losers when it comes to rolling out a new way of measuring. So if your SEO was previously worth 100 and now it's worth 120, and your PPC was worth 120 and now that's worth 100, then there's the channel managers, one of them is going to be particularly happy, John's going to be delighted, but the PPC manager is not going to be. And so navigating that and actually getting everyone on the side and explaining what you're doing and how you're doing it, and the steps you'll take, and actually it's a winner for the overall. What we're trying to do is it's going to be a winner for the business is really important.
Just one thing, what's also helped is educate the wider business on what's important to the particular different channels.
Yeah.
So suddenly asking someone in the content production department to help SEO isn't seen as a chore, because now SEO has a value,
Yeah.
and everybody knows what it's worth, and that in itself was revolutionary in terms of getting stuff done.
So we started working with third party to us data, but I mean their tracking data, existing tracking data, and then rather than feel that we had to do a mazy analysis on it to come up with the ultimate model, in fact what we found was the most valuable thing to do was implement a really quite simple attribution model very, very quickly. So using our experience with similar kind of retailers and using their understanding of their customer, we implemented a model very, very quickly and started producing reports. So rather than a project taking months and months of retagging and then months and months of analysis before we actually produce anything of any value, within the first few weeks of actually engaging with House of Fraser, we were producing a new set of numbers which looked different from what they were used to and were a lot more useful for tuning up and recognising the value in the different channels. So that's I guess it's a theme of the way that we like to engage, is to produce value early. And even though you may know that there's some compromise in there, it's always a lot better to have a better view than to have one which you just happen to know is really dramatically compromised. So that's a good example. The next part of the challenge was to implement a tracking system that would actually allow them to start connecting up with devices, and that's this whole universal user idea, and also to track devices like their app, which previously they hadn't tracked. The next piece was to actually develop a statistically valid attribution model, and it's those joining the touch points and then developing the model that I'm kind of going to talk about now. I hope the next slide is more familiar. No, this is not the one that I was expecting, but I'm going to skip through this quite quickly because I hate this slide. But it's meant to represent the user journey, and we've had a million ways of representing this, so you're probably bored of seeing that people use lots of devices and click lots. So let's ignore it a little bit. But I mean, the points that I think are really valid on here are that just tracking activity, tracking activity up until the point of sale is actually flawed as well, because the whole thing is that we know that if we do really good marketing, we should be creating customers who buy multiple times, and therefore one of the things that the slide entertainingly demonstrates is that there are actually multiple sales, and in fact the second sale could in some way be related to crediting some of this early activity. The other thing that the slide was trying to illustrate dramatically was that touch points have a whole load of attributes about them to do with device, to do with a level of interaction, to do with number of page views and time on site. This does have some relevance to what we do with House of Fraser, and that was that when we analysed these journeys, we actually saw that as well as touch points from different channels having a different value, so things like natural search at a particular point in time on certain keywords were really great visits to the site. What we also saw was there was a correlation in the time spent on the site and the number of pages that were viewed in terms of the value of that visit in terms of changing people's propensity to purchase. And that fed in later to the way we do the attribution model. I'll try and explain that. I'm just optimistic the next slide is it's not what was meant to be there. So the next point was going to be to say, in the process then of trying to build up a multi-device attribution model, what were the ways that House of Fraser chose to try and join up the devices? And what they did was, by implementing Storm's tracking sort of out of the box, there is this concept of tracking all channels for particular devices. So our tracking tracks direct, SEO, PPC, all the ways that people come to a site. So out of the box, that's what our tracking did for them. They also do quite large amounts of display advertising. So again, our tracking out of the box connects in display impressions to this view of a customer's visits to the website, and our universal user technology allows them to join up the different devices. They decided to do that joining of devices based on a really, really simple way, and that was they're going to wait until people transact and give up their email address, and at that point they would join that device with any other transaction that had happened with the same email address. So a really simple way of joining, which you wouldn't necessarily expect to join up a large number of users, because it relies on the fact that people have to transact on different devices in order for you to actually make that connection. But one of the attributes of House of Fraser is they've got lots and lots of loyal customers. So a large number of their sales are from a small number of people who repeatedly buy. So in actual fact, very quickly we began to actually join up significant numbers of users and began to see that they were actually using multiple devices. The next stage was to implement an email program, which we've started to do now, where are there these timed emails being sent out to try and capture people on different devices at different times of the day. One of the more interesting aspects is this concept of in-store terminals, because in those sort of browsing stores, they've got terminals where people actually go on and place orders. And of course that created machines that seem to have thousands and thousands of people buying loads and loads of stuff. And so we had to treat those differently from the devices which people had in their home. So maybe Peter could describe roughly that.
Yeah, it's a very simple solution. The devices were encoded so that any traffic coming from those devices could be identified separately, and we essentially only included the individual transactions from those devices in the standard model, rather than using the cookies that were constantly present on those devices. So we stopped, within that device itself, we stopped the multi-cookie joining technology from working.
I guess the point that I'd make on that, although it's quite a simple solution, it illustrates one of the things that there's always special things that you need to do for companies' unique solutions. And I guess that when you work with providers like Google and the very big analytics providers, they're not necessarily very keen to actually come up with solutions like that. So even though it was something that was relatively simple for us to do, it was because we're a small, responsive team of technology people who can actually make those changes. Whereas if you actually called up Google and said, can you change the tracking so I can exclude this device and treat it differently, clearly it'd be quite a difficult thing for you to get to happen. The next section was, okay, we've joined this up, and I'm now just going to give a very crash course in the issues around attribution. When you've collected up all these user journeys that are very complicated and use lots of different devices, how do you make a decision about how to distribute the value? And I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but the three key points are, when a transaction happens, how do you decide in this big journey of interactions, how do you decide which of those events you're going to include in the sharing process? So how do you decide how far you're going to look back in the journey? The next issue you need to do is, how do you make a valuation on which events within that journey had most influence on changing people's propensity to purchase? So our approach is that you can just write rules for making those decisions. How far am I going to look back? How am I going to do the sharing? But when you do that, you just make decisions. All you're doing is you're systemizing your prejudices, your opinions about how people are shopping. So our approach at DC Storm is very much to use statistical analysis to actually analyse the journeys, compare the journeys which ended in success and with sale with the journeys that didn't end in success and without sale, and try and identify statistically which are the events that are most contributing most to changing that propensity to purchase. So the idea of our attribution modelling is not to implement our opinion or for us to use the experience of what we've learned from other retailers and map that onto somebody else. It's to actually use their data and analyse it statistically in order to try and identify what's an attribution model that actually fits. The third part is that if you look at a retailer like House of Fraser, what you'll see is that there are quite distinct groups of behaviours. And with House of Fraser, the most key groups were people who shopped with them before and people who were absolutely new customers. And their journeys were completely different, and there was a completely different number of them. There's obviously loads and loads of people rebuying, and there's a small proportion of people who are actually the most interesting ones, who are meeting the brand for the first time and making the decision to buy. So if you build an attribution model that reflects the average, even if it's statistically the average, it tends to not actually be very useful at all, because it's not the behaviour of anybody. So what you actually need to do is create the grouping around people who have never bought before. What does their journey look like? How far am I going to look back? How am I going to identify the events that change their propensity to purchase? Do it for the new customers, and then do it completely separately for the existing customers. And that's what we did with House of Fraser. And the attribution model for those two groups is actually completely different. Now, there are other groupings for different businesses which are really, really important, but for House of Fraser, the key ones were new and existing. I think that over time, we will refine that segmentation in a way to reflect things like if they're a new customer and they buy something, their first purchase is over a certain amount, there's probably going to be a slightly different journey for those people from people who end up buying something very cheap. So it's early stage of segmentation, but those are the kind of key three aspects about how they've gone about building an attribution model.
On the segmentation side of new and existing, one thing that became apparent looking at the data is if someone has purchased before but then has a gap for a period of time, they then become a new customer again in their behaviour. And that time for House of Fraser was 4 months. So essentially, if they haven't purchased for 4 months, their behaviour falls back into the ways of a new customer again.
And clearly that's another example of something that you shouldn't just go away and take House of Fraser's 4 months, because clearly if you're selling holidays which people only buy once a year, then everybody will always be a new customer. So, that's the kind of thing you have to look out for.
What do you do with the data of people who don't buy anything?
Well, it's crucial, because by the journeys that look like the purchase journeys but don't actually end in purchase are the ones which are really useful for making that comparison, because you can then say, okay, we've got 100 journeys that didn't end in purchase and we've got these 10 that did. Let's look at when they did include an SEO visit in the last week. How important was that statistically in meaning that they did purchase there in the group of 10 as opposed to in the group that didn't convert? And it's that ability to compare the converting journeys with the non-converting which allows you to do the really good modelling. So I guess it's one of the big differentiators of different types of technology. Some technologies are absolutely focused on just creating the journeys, and they effectively throw away all the other data because it is less interesting. But it's only by collecting all the other data that you can actually do the analysis, which really gives you a statistically valid way of doing attribution. And the trouble with that is there's clearly 10 times as much of that data as there is of the converting data. So it's a technical challenge, but some of the providers have dealt with that and others haven't, and they throw lots of data away. So it's a key part of enabling you to do it.
You were saying about that journey. Is it actually, have you actually seen that there can be specific instances on that journey that make a big difference?
Yes.
Yeah, so when we're looking at performance of display, for example, we look specifically at journeys of touch points that are exactly the same, and we compare conversion rates of the users who've seen display ads within that journey versus those that have had exactly the same journey but without the display ad. So we're seeing how that display ad has affected their propensity to purchase. And often the differences will be small, but with the statistical modelling technology we've got, we're able to look at millions of different variations and build up a picture of what's actually got statistical relevance and what's just a random difference between two small behaviours.
I suppose one of the things that's great about a business like House of Fraser is it's a challenge to collect all the data, but there's enough of it to test loads of really detailed stuff because they've got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of visitors every single day. So it's an exciting opportunity for us to really get granular. The thing that was interesting with them was, and this was just another feature, so we look at the journeys, we look at when certain touch points happen and what the influence they have on the propensity to purchase. But what we also spotted during the analysis was the time spent on the site seemed to have a huge influence, regardless of how the person got to the site. The time they spent on the site seemed to be a huge influence on their likelihood to purchase. And so we incorporated within the sharing model an element of wherever they came from and at wherever it was in the journey, the amount of time they spent on the site actually upweighted or downweighted the value of that particular touch point. Now, that was because that's what the data told us. It wasn't something that we went in looking for. And we've looked at it with other brands where it seems to be completely irrelevant, where there's a very short conversion, a short decision time on cheaper product. It just doesn't seem relevant. But with House of Fraser, it seemed to be a really important way of measuring the value of a visit to the site. So that was something that was actually quite unique to them. And so we've called that kind of we've incorporated engagement or this time on site as being part of their attribution model. I think I've covered this next one. This is just trying to very badly illustrate there are different types of customers. I think the upside down ones are the people who are new, and the upright ones are the existing customers, but I'm not quite sure how that works. Peter's already talked a bit about measuring display, but this again was one of the really interesting areas because, for a start, everybody's got tend to have very strong opinions about does display advertising work. And I know for a long time that Peter and I have endlessly wondered why people spend so much money on display. But in actual fact, we've actually become converts because the stats really do say that in the right circumstances, display advertising has a big impact on the way that people, in the way that people's propensity to purchase. But the
stats really show that when it has an impact, it has a big impact, but most of the time it has no impact. So the balance is identifying when it has an impact, and then is the balance of cost versus impact does it make that activity worthwhile? But it absolutely does have an impact on a proportion of the instances that you show your ads to someone.
I just find display such a wide category. I mean, does this include retargeting?
Well, I was just going to come on to that. And just before I do, the thing that I think is most counterintuitive is when people talk about display, they generally talk about, well, it doesn't convert, but, it builds people's understanding of a brand, and it means that when they do want to buy that thing, they'll go back to that brand. But what the stats tell us with House of Fraser, that's absolutely not the case. If they see a display ad, and then they actually click through within a very short period of time, and we're talking not days, we're talking hours, then it does have an effect. But if they click through beyond that very short period of time, it has virtually no effect at all. And that window of how long it does have an effect is completely different for retargeting than it is for just a kind of random sort of what's normally talked about brand building kind of untargeted display.
You've got run a network where you might buy some really cheap inventory versus lookalike campaigns where you're actively targeting similar customers to retargeting. So I think it's very hard when you just look at it as display. It's such a big category.
Well, I guess this is what this clever slide is meant to represent. There's different types. No, I'm stretching the slide there. But you're absolutely right. So part of our whole approach is to be very granular about the way that we do the trafficking of display advertising. So we absolutely want to know, if possible, where the ads were shown by using tracking, which will actually identify the URLs in which they were shown. But some networks don't allow that. But as much as possible, we want to get very granular with it, and we want to identify the attributes of the display advertising in a very granular way. So you're absolutely right. We are not in the business of saying it does or doesn't work. It's more about saying, here's a really good way of measuring whether it has or hasn't worked. Let's now do campaigns and actually have relative and absolute measures of the success of it, knowing how we're expecting it to behave. So even if you don't absolutely believe in the valuation of it, let's at least have a way of saying this creative appeared to work better than this creative, or this network appeared to work better than this network, or this mechanism. So it's a really complicated area, but I think that beginning to measure it, having an attribution model based on statistics and not on hunches or prejudices, is the right way to begin.
You need a consistent way of measuring it. And there's definitely different categories. When you set a campaign up, you have a different category, and that will fit into a certain category before you even know. So you wouldn't set up a branding campaign in the same way as you'd set up a remarketing campaign. You give it a different identifier to start with, and then it would inherit the attribution model for that different campaign type. And then the really important thing is once you've got this in place, as Lewis said, you've then got a consistent way to measure. So you can then kick off, test that campaign, and then you can judge for yourself whether it's actually been successful or not, because the data will tell you.
We're also for display specifically, we're doing A/B tests with House of Fraser. So we're looking at we're creating different audiences. Some audiences will be showing their ads, some audiences won't, and we'll be seeing scientifically seeing a difference of the behaviour of those users. So where you've got a user that behaves in exactly the same way in every sense on the web, but hasn't been shown the ad, to one that has shown all the same behaviour on the World Wide Web as a whole. And we can then look at the performance of the two groups. That's really useful for retargeting. So there's a big question mark at the moment as to whether it's actually worth paying for, or would you have got those sales anyway? Would you have still encouraged those customers back? And with retargeting, it's really straightforward because you can create audiences. You don't have to display ads to people who are in the test audience. The rest of the audience is straightforward, and you can very easily see the incremental difference.
Do you do that?
We do a lot of retargeting at the moment, and we do some display. We're just looking at lookalikes, mostly in Europe, really.
Yeah.
So it's just quite interesting because even if you break out the types of display, like we've got one with the network area where they focus a lot more on incentive side. So you're going to get a different type of customer who is like that's valuable to you when you're doing premium media in France or something like that. So that's just
One interesting thing is homepage takeovers and what sort of aggressive display advertising where the user actually has to close it down to get rid of it. And that does appear in some ways of measurement as being really successful because lots of people accidentally click on it. So when you do the analysis, the bounce rate on that type of ad, so people who leave the site immediately, is about 99%. So almost everyone that even clicks on that ad is doing it accidentally and just leave it.
It's like those rollover ads where you try and remove it and then you end up on the site. It's just a complete waste.
I mean, getting that kind of understanding within your business of being able to test. I mean, that's one of the byproducts of doing attribution, a good attribution product. Is you have to go through that evaluation of all of your different categories and different segments and different types of campaigns. And just by going through that process, you learn a lot. And so by us going through that with other clients, we were building their attribution model. We've worked out actually this kind of display works really well for you. This kind doesn't, and they've made really significant changes in their strategy. They've ditched those type A, type B campaigns, had no degradation at all in performance, saved a load of money, and then reinvested it into other channels. And that's where attribution becomes really valuable.
I probably shouldn't say this, but also if you go to Struck and Criteo and say you're going to run an A/B test to see who works best, they put a lot of effort into your campaigns for the first few months, regardless of
what you just talk about Criteo versus Struck. So that's
well, I mean, tell them you're going head to head with a test, and they've got plenty of evidence. There's people like us helping companies do it, and you find you get a lot more attention.
Or am I not allowed to ask that question?
What's that?
Who do you find winning?
It's again, it's like all my answers today. It depends on the brand and the strategy.
I'll tell you off camera.
Okay, the results and actions. This is again not my slide, but anyway, we'll put that aside. Although it's a very simple joining of just using this sale as a way of using email address to join up multiple devices, we've actually seen that in the last month, 60% of people who've bought multiple times, so where there is an opportunity to identify multiple devices, there has actually been multiple devices identified for them. So our sense is that, unsurprisingly, House of Fraser is a brand which has got a really big multi-device customer base, and we're now rolling out a whole bunch of other techniques to try and join up those other devices, and that's the next part of our engagement with them. They're using the attribution data, like lots of other people, to, rather than have one measurement system and then completely separately use a different tracking system to optimise PPC, which is quite common, they're actually smartly using the data now that we're attributing, and they're feeding that into their bid management solution. They're realigning their affiliate commissions, and we're going to talk about another case study that's, I think we're talking about that case study, to do with affiliate commissions. And so what they're hoping to do is start paying affiliate commission based on the contribution of affiliates within the journey. So not just saying that if the cookie's present, they're going to get the full commission. They're going to be saying, if the cookie's present, what's their contribution in the journey, and what proportion of their commission does that reflect in their attribution model? So
they're not hoping to do that, they are doing that now.
okay,
Been
there you go.
live for about a month.
And as I've said before, the really, I think the really important stuff is beyond the numbers and everything. They're gaining a far better understanding of how they generate new customers. So there's a whole load of decisions made about what they do and don't do, and what marketing they do and what merchandising they do, which reflects the fact that they actually understand these user journeys. So I think that's the really important stuff. What it is also beginning to feed into is, rather than them just having a budgeting process, which is, we spent this last year, should we spend roughly the same, or should we spend a bit more here and a bit less there? They're starting to budget on the basis of saying, right, let's start from what's actually working. Let's build up a budget based on our understanding of what's actually working. And that sounds a pretty obvious thing to do, but with a big company like House of Fraser, with loads of legacy and lots of momentum in the channels that they're working in, it's a big shift to suddenly say, we're going to do the budgeting based on what works. And that'll evolve rather than be a sort of step change from one mechanism to the other. Hopefully that's a good introduction to an engagement of DC Storm with and Search Labs with a really massive omni-channel retailer, and a really exciting one.